series is entitled Places in the Heart. The place for the morning is the desert. Scripture is in Genesis, beginning at the 12th chapter. The life is the life of Abraham. There's nothing in the story of Abraham that identifies him with the desert. Spirituality has done that. That's where the idea comes from. Abraham is often misrepresented as somebody who wandered aimlessly for a very long time in wasteland. He did not. He moved in a migratory pattern that other people were following south from Padan Aram, where his father had brought him, out of Ur of the Chaldees. And when he heard the call of God, he'd already left Ur long before that. And he moved in concert with many other people, never too far from settled areas, and continued a life of animal husbandry and a semi-nomadic existence that he'd known before. Abraham's journey was in the heart. It was nothing unusual to human eyes, but it was a journey that began in the as we read in the 12th chapter, the first verse. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." It's a journey of the heart that begins with leaving, a journey known to many of you because in order to be here you left somewhere else. And for some of you, the place that you left is far away. For many of you, it is geographical. Regina is not your home. Canada may not be your home. But far more acute than that, what you left behind and what you are becoming is something internal. There is a shaping and a forming in you that you can sense distancing you knew and from the you that other people knew. You are under construction. It's not yet known what you will be like, but you have begun the journey. And like Abraham, it's a journey in the heart, through a place that's in the heart. It all starts when you leave. As I say that, I'm thinking of Lynn Jones, whom you do not know, but whom I know. And in my mind's eye, I'm sitting across a kitchen table with Lynn, drinking a cup of coffee and trying to help her come to terms with her journey. What she is leaving is her husband. She's leaving her husband, even though her heart aches and every fiber of her being revolts at the idea. Everything she's ever been taught says, no, she has no choice. He's begun to discharge loaded firearms in the house. Her children are terrified. They're beginning to gather up anything they think. They're beginning to manifest psychological disturbances which she cannot tolerate. And we have prayed for miracles, and we believe in miracles, but they aren't here yet. And I am helping her drive down a lonely highway with a pickup truck full of sticks, of furniture, little bags of clothing, and old used toys, to leave a big, expensive home and move into a fire trap. And as a pastor, I'm trying to help her start life as a single parent. She does not want to be there. But that's the leaving that's for her. When we leave that morning, drinking a cup of coffee together and praying together, I say, "Is there anything else we can do for you?" And she says, "Yes. Could we have a sandbox?" And so my next act for the rest of the day is to round up a sandbox and some brick sand from the local quarry and build it in the backyard so that her kids can play in the sandbox. And I realize that I am sharing her journey in some sense or other. The leaving that God calls our hearts to do is often a mystery, and the direction where we're headed with this is rarely clear or made known. Generally, all you know is that God called you, and you start on the journey. That's where the desert begins, your entry to it. And so Abram passes through the land of Canaan. And when he comes to a place where Bethel's on the west and Ai on the east, there he builds an altar to the Lord and invokes the name of the Lord in the midst of all of the gods of Canaan, here and there associated with all of the names and all of the places. He erects an altar to a God he scarcely knows and calls upon the Lord, and journeyed on by stages toward the Negeb. I don't think we're often willing to admit how mysterious the ways of God seem to us, and sometimes the level of terror that rises up within us at knowing that we follow what we do not know and in directions that are not altogether clear. And yet, It is God who has called. Abram takes a sojourn in Egypt when there is a famine. And I'm counting on your knowledge of his story so that I may move quickly. His disposition of his wife calling her his sisters and her inclusion in Pharaoh's harem teaches both Abram and Sarah and the Pharaoh of Egypt that if God has called you, other people ought not to mess with his purposes. And that God will accomplish those purposes and will bring them to pass. And the presence of God, the hand of God, and the strong sanction against standing outside his will and his purposes becomes clearly known, even if the end of those purposes isn't. I'm beset behind and before. I'm in the hands of God. He controls what I'm doing, what I'm saying. So Abraham went up from Egypt and went into the Negev, he together with Lot, whom you know is his nephew, and prospered in Egypt, and prospering again there, discovers, like the words of the old Western, there ain't room in this town for both of us. And Lot's people and Abram's people don't get along. So Abram says, why should there be strife? Choose where you want to go and separate from me. And Abram yields his right by seniority to choose himself and allows that thing that often comes in the midst of our journey in the desert, the yielding to somebody else of a right that is ours, the letting go of something that is rightfully ours, the entrance of some little bit of injustice, a little bit of unfairness. And Lot chooses what the eyes can see as good. And Abraham is left with that which is by comparison wilderness, but which also has scattered over it nothing less and nothing more than the promise of God. For as Abraham goes into it, God says, rise up and walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. That too is part of the desert. Promise. Scattered over something that doesn't look like it's ever going to amount to anything. While faced with someone else whose journey is far more luxurious by comparison. It is the journey of the student who is laboring long and hard to hold a 2.0 average, while somebody else seems to be able to click off A papers in the hardest courses as though they were nothing. It is the journey of the student who is laboring to listen to a lecture in a second language and knows full well that you can't understand a word after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And you go back to your dorm or to your office or to your computer with your head aching, knowing for certain that at some point they're going to ask you a question on the final about something you just couldn't take any longer. You couldn't take it in. And it's not fair, and it's not just, and it's not equitable, and it's not right. It's just part of the journey through the desert that's in the heart. Is there any point to this? Some of you are going to that, by the way. It's called language study. And you're clicking off A's now, but by the time you get to the field, you're going to spend 4 years as an infant, and at the end of that, you'll wonder, what was the point of my being here? I don't even know this language, and they want me to learn another one when I'm done. As someone pointed out to me today, frequently, any work that God does through you isn't because you learned the language to Andy's sermon. It was because at some point, under all of the pressure that you experienced, you responded with patience to a child. Or when everything should have said that you ought to break forth in anger, you didn't. In other words, that the whole purpose to this part of the journey through the desert was nothing more nor less than to generate the character of God. And it was through that God worked. Yeah, and all the things you learned in seminary, we're still waiting to hear from you because you can't tell anybody in that language what's going on. Is that worthless? Is that a waste of time? What will you do with the injustice of it? With the inequity? With the worst, the ambiguity, and the absurdity of that place? You see, the desert is first and foremost a place where you become God's formation, where you are made, not where you make, but where you're made. And so Abram, at the time when his nephew Lot is taken captive, rises up in a confederacy of others, and in a military action releases his nephew when he's released. And there's sort of a victory celebration afterwards when Abram in the 14th chapter encounters Melchizedek, king of Salem, and offers him tithes. Blessings pronounced, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram becomes nothing less than this, someone identified with God Most High, and other people know it. And it becomes obvious that God's hand is on Abram. And then later, when he's offered by one of those who share in the victory his share of the spoils, Abram offers this in answer: "I've sworn to the Lord God Most High, maker of heaven and earth," there's that name again, "that I would not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, so that you might not say, I have made Abram rich." And therefore the desert and the journey through the desert is not simply the place where I will be formed by God, but where I will be formed by God alone. And in order to do that, the other things that might form my life are released. And there is a process of letting go. Dear brother and sister, some of you live there right now. And the letting go, some of the subtle things of the heart, that's the agenda right now. The desert is the place where you become God's formation. Abram's journey continues. In the next 3 chapters, which I'm not going to allude to, through the giving and elaboration of God's covenant, the birth of Ishmael, who, though not part of God's fulfillment of promise to Abraham, still receives God's promise and God's care, to the sign of the covenant giving of circumcision, and finally the promise that Abram will have a son of God's provision. Which brings me to the 18th chapter. In the journey that Abram undertakes, now called Abraham, the Lord appears to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. When I read this, I have passed through 4 chapters, but I have also passed through decades of life, and to realize the time God takes to fulfill his purposes in the heart. But Abram's still in the journey of the desert. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Here God does not simply speak. God approaches. Here you can see and touch. And here the hospitality of Abram opens up and receives the Lord. In the Orthodox tradition, there is an icon of the Trinity that finds its scriptural origin in this story. That God has manifested himself, and whether your theology extends that far or not, my understanding of God's approach to Abraham is found in these verses. And Abraham extends his fellowship, the hospitality that he ought to. And God speaks the promise again that he will have a son, and Sarah laughs. Sarah's confronted about her laughter. She denies her laughter and is confronted again. Some of us at that point are inclined to say, you'd better be careful. But God's purposes are not so fragile. But it is what follows that to which I want to draw your attention. In the 16th verse of that chapter 18, then the men set out from there, and they looked towards Sodom, and Abram went with them to set them on their way and complete his hospitality toward them. And the Lord said, hear these words, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? No. For I have chosen him that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to? No, I will not hide from Abraham what I am about to do. And so the New Testament calls Abraham the friend of God. What an astonishing concept. I can't find any closer roots than here in this text. That Abraham should be the friend of God seems to be saying that having been formed by God, he is not simply placed somewhere in God's mantelpiece or in a trophy case. But Abraham enters into the heart of God because God makes him privy, not to all the wisdom of the universe, but to his purposes within the limits of his life. Shall I hide? Shall Abraham be allowed to seek out and try and find the will of God? No. So it was some thing like you're discovering your parents' Christmas presents to use sometime before they're supposed to be like that. Something far more and far deeper. God reveals himself. And the purposes of his heart within the circumference of Abraham's life to Abraham. And it almost seems to me, I hope I'm not pushing it too far, but God says, I can't bear to leave until, as though there was an agenda left to the very end, but revealed, that Abraham would not merely be God's formation, but God's friend. We sing, I want to know you, Lord. If that be true, there is a path to the knowledge of God which begins when I say, yes, then, God, form me. Let me live with the ambiguity of that and the unanswered questions of it. Even if at the end the questions are never answered, but in the process of it, I may become the friend of God and understand the things that God can reveal to me. There's something about the heart of God, I think, that we malign when we somehow suggest that we have to wring out of him his love, his knowledge, his will, as though it was the last drop of juice from a recalcitrant orange. I think the truth is that God longs to reveal his heart to those he can have and shape. So there follows after this, for Abraham has entered into covenant, and God has committed himself to Abraham, the revelation of what God is going to do. Then the Lord said, how great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah? How very great is the outcry. They have done altogether according to the outcry. If not, I will not. Lot is in Sodom and Gomorrah. God reveals his intent to Abram, but he also invites Abram's response. We often, again, I think, speak of God and relate within our hearts to God as someone who is, if you like flint, inflexible. And that therefore, once our submission is secured, there is nothing else left. But God invites let me take it upon myself to speak to the Lord, Abram says. What if there are 50 righteous? Will you destroy the city? It almost sounds like someone haggling in a market. What if there are 40? What if there are 30? What if there are 20? What if there are 10? And God entertains the intercession of Abraham. The product of that is the release of Lot and his family, even though when you read the text, they're far from righteous. They are nonetheless part of that covenant that was made. And Abram, who became the friend of God, becomes that thing that is now unpopular for us to speak of, but I think is the end result
of what God wants to do with us in the desert, he becomes the friend of sinners. He becomes the one who intercedes on behalf of someone else. We live in an age where a burden for church growth has replaced what used to be called a burden for souls, where we are concerned that our congregations are large, which it seems to me used to be the product of a burden for souls. And I'm intrigued with the way that Abraham whittles it down. We go from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 to 50. He went from 50 to 40 to 30 to 20, 10. As though he could not allow that there would be one righteous without someone who would plead for them. What if God's purpose in the desert in your heart is to so shape you and form you that you may know the mind and purposes of God in order that you may pray? Would that be enough? When I spoke similar thoughts in another context, a missionary came to me and said, for a year, God has been showing me things about our mission that are not right. He didn't mean moral errors, but things that were disturbing and thwarting the work of God. And she said, I used to ask God, why are you showing me this? Why are you revealing this to me? And then she added, now I know I am to pray. Out of that prayer will grow every other good thing, but until that prayer has come from a mind that has been shaped by God, and a mind that has become such a friend to God that God can reveal his purposes, no true prayer, I think, really comes that changes anything. The question is this: if it's the desert that you're in, that's the place in your heart, and a journey through it is what you're undergoing, is that okay? I mean this. Is it okay that God should have you in that process at the point at which you find yourself, so that your heart says, even if I can't see the end of this in the beginning, I will be where I am and let God do what he's doing? Can you say that? That is, in a sense, a yielding of the resistance that our heart, I think, has by nature and by sin nature to the work of God. I will let God do what he is doing. I will say yes to Jesus. Can you say it in a way that is not simply the resignation of a heart that says, God is sovereign, what can anyone say? And so in the presence of it, you simply go limp, and you put up passive resistance to the will of God. Do what you want. But there is no gladness, there is no growing unity. Can you say, yes, Lord, on this journey, the place in the heart, with my struggles and all of the difficulty that goes along with it, I would be formed by God, that I might become the friend of God, that I might become the friend of sinners. On that, I invite you to reflect for a few quiet moments that we'll have at the end of each of these chapel sessions. Sure, you'll play a bit for us when the time comes.